can tell you about the town comes from being the granddaughter of one of the men in that book. And the man's name was Min Hasty. And I don't know if you remember that he was the man who dreamed about irrigation and a lot of other things, did a lot of things. And I'll be telling you today about some of the things. And I can tell you those because being my grandfather, even though I never knew the man, he died before I was ever born, I know a lot of stories that have come down to me and through our family about Granddad and about early Arapahoe. Grandfather came to this community in 1871, okay? He had been, I believe, in Iowa for a while, and then Grand Island. He was originally from the state of Maine. He was, for his day, he had a better education than most people. Most people in the 1870s, if you went to school 4 years or 8 years would be a very good education. Well, he went to school that time, and then he went to what they called an academy, which would be equivalent to our college. And so he was, what you would say for those days, an educated man to come to this area. Well, he came on horseback. All right, that's 1871 now. There wasn't anything here. The river was here. The valley was here. No trees. No trees on the prairie. You're imagining this in your mind. Very few trees. Lots of buffalo. Okay. Lots of wild game. Wolves lived here in those days. Lots of prairie wolves. When he rode down over the hill, he came from Lexington, and it wasn't Lexington at that time. There wasn't any town at Lexington at that time. It was a trading post on the Platte River up there called Plum Creek. And I'll show you a picture later on of Plum Creek in the early days. And that was the closest that the Arapahoe pioneers, the early people who came here, they had to go by wagon. So it was quite a trip. If you've driven to Lexington by car, you know it's 30, 40 miles up there to Plum Creek. And to go by horse and wagon, you wouldn't go very often, maybe once a month to get your supplies. Let's go back to Granddad coming. When he finally decided to come and stake his claim, all right, my granddad's house, I don't know, any of you know, up on the hill, it'd be from the school over here to the last street, and you go straight north, the Episcopal Church, and then go straight north up that road, okay? And up on the hill, there's a little white house and a big red barn on the right-hand side of the road. Do you know where that is? Huh? Dr. Moline, the veterinary at Holbrook, owns that right now. But that barn, my grandfather built, okay? And on that property there, he built an 8-sided house. I'll tell you about that in a minute. His first thing that he did, that first winter that he wanted to stay here, he went over to the creek because Elk Creek runs right along on the side there of Arapahoe. Mm-hmm. Okay, he made a dugout. Dug it out of the bank, banked it and everything else. He hadn't anymore gotten this finished, this dugout for the winter. Then here came a wagon over the trail, coming into Arapahoe. Here came a wagon load with a man whose name was Professor DeAlmond. Okay, and you remember the DeAlmond name, it's been here a long time. And Professor DeAlmond had 9 children in his wagon. He and his 9 children decided, and they stayed the winter. My granddad gave him his dugout to live in, loaned it to them so the family would have, it was getting cold. They came through here like this time of year, and it was getting snowy and cold to be out doing wagons. So they decided to spend the winter here. Well, Professor DeAlmond and his family stayed there in the dugout, and my granddad went to Burton's Bend, we're friends of his, and he spent the winter there. Okay. My granddad was kind of a nomad. He loved to trap and fish and hunt. And his favorite place to go was up in the Sandhills on the Dismal River, which is northwest of here. And I'll tell you a little interesting story there. He said he'd done very well one winter. And trapping and hunting, and he hid his furs and things down in the rocks and covered them all up and everything. Now, when they went up there, it wasn't just a trading post. It was not a Walmart supermarket, you know. There wasn't any such thing in those days, okay? You got to think of it, and I'll show you some pictures, and you'll see that it was not very much. The only other place outside of Plum Creek was right down here at Holbrook, just south on the river, to a place called Burton's Bend, okay? And you remember reading about that, because that was our first settlement here, okay? When my grandfather, in 1871, rode over the hill from Plum Creek on his horse, dropped down into the valley, here were these men out here, pounding stakes in the valley floor. And he was immediately struck. He said it was a beautiful, beautiful area. And so he rode up and he asked them what they were doing. And they said, well, they were Captain Murphy's men out of Plattsmouth, Nebraska. And they were here staking out a town that was to be called Arapahoe. And Grandpa looked around and liked it and everything else. Staked a claim. And in those days, if you wanted to stake a claim, there wasn't any claim officer, no government buildings, there was nothing here. So he had to go down to Bloomington, Nebraska, which is down east of Alma and Orleans, if you know where that area is down there, southeast of here. And that's where you had to go to register a claim. So he registered his claim, and then I think he went back either to Grand Island or for the winter, and then came back the next year. Well, anyway, they went ahead and the town got started. Now, like I said, you got to make this in your mind. There wasn't anything here. There weren't any roads. Okay. Granddad came in on this trail. All right. Now, as in my research, all I've been able to find is that at one time there was an old Indian trail that came from the northeast. I would repeat this, I have not been able to verify that, because I've talked to a lot of people who live out in that area to see if they could find any traces of an old trail. But they said the Indians used to come through here. My grandfather's statement was he only saw the Indians the only reason they came was when they were hunting, and they would travel through here. Now I suppose that's how they got the name Arapahoe. Granddad used to talk with them, visit with them. I'll tell you a story a little later about what he found from one of them. And he always was interested in finding out what they knew about this country. The first buildings, there's one house on the property. The first home that was built is Main Street. Do you all know where Main Street is? Mm-hmm. It would be the one south of Mark Hamel's place of business that runs east and west. Okay, has a substation over on this side. Crawford's is on the corner. You know, do you all know where we're talking about down there? That originally, when they laid out the town, they thought would be the main drag. Okay, you got to remember there was no train, no nothing through here then. Okay, in the early days. All right, the first property that I've been able to research is. Let's see, I can't tell you who lives on it, but it's the road going down to the dump. Have you ever been down to the dump? Any of you taking stuff down there? Okay, there's a little white house that sits on there. That property was the first homestead that was filed, I think, here. The others all started up right around the K-store. There were a couple of farms, that sat there. Of course, no roads in and out of town or anything. All right. The first town buildings were where Dean and Tim Bensel lives. How many of you know where Dean and Wanda Tim Bensel live? That'd be the first road going north and south, east of Arapahoe. You cross the creek out here, and you go north, and they live and Hamels live up the road too. Okay? On that road is where a lot of the early settlers lived. I'll show you a picture that I have of my aunt and uncle that lived there. Their soddy was there, up on that road, and there a lot of people lived up and down. There used to be an old schoolhouse up north up that road, which is no longer there. It's just a field. You wouldn't even know, unless you research it, you wouldn't know that there had been a school there. Okay, so that went all the way down to the river, and then they came into Arapahoe that way, because there wasn't any highway like we know it today. No, remember, no highways, nothing in and out. Okay, now there wasn't, you need to understand about the river, okay? When I was a little girl, I was born in 1935. So when I was a little girl in 1935, the Republican River down here was called the Mighty Republican, and believe me, it was mighty. At that time, I can't tell you how wide it was, big, quite a distance across. But we didn't have any dams to the west of us like we have at Trenton and Cambridge and all the places that we have now. There was nothing to stop the flow of the river. So the Republican was one of the swiftest in Nebraska. It dropped in elevation 1 foot every mile. So the water ran deep and fast when I was a little kid. We only had one man in Arapahoe, a man by the name of Mr. Curry, and you probably remember reading about him. And he was strong enough and big enough that he could swim the river. If you needed some reason to get across the river, he could do that. Took a very powerful. Many people who fell in just drowned. There was absolutely no way to save them because they just get washed away. Okay? So but the Republican at that time was quite dangerous. And then in 1935, when I was 5 years old, we had a devastating flood. It rained for 4 days solid, and more rain than the river could handle, and it flooded the whole valley. And up and down, probably from the west to the east, we probably lost over 200 people drowned in the flood. Most of the people lost all their livestock. My uncle, I know, had registered Hereford cattle, and they were all swept away. And many people lost homes. They had a big 3-story house that fell off into the river. The river ate around, and the house money fell in. It was a terrible time, and many people lost their lives. One of my girlfriend's dads lost his life down here. They were working at the light plant, and he tried to go hand over hand on the wires, hit a bare spot, and it electrocuted him. Okay? My granddad was kind of a nomad. He loved to trap and fish and hunt. And his favorite place to go was up in the sandhills on the Dismal River, which is northwest of here. And I'll tell you a little interesting story there. He said he'd done very well one winter, and trapping and hunting, and he hid his furs and things down in the rocks and covered them all up and everything, and went intending to go back in the spring to pick them up. And when he got back, the Indians had found his stash, and so he lost all of his winter's work, which was pretty costly. So it made it a kind of a thin year if you're relying on that to make a little money. Well, anyway, and those of you who read early Arapahoe know that my grandfather was ahead of his time, you might say, for the country. Okay, over the Mighty Republican, he built the first river. He knew enough about engineering to put stakes in the water and how to build a bridge. Well, what would a bridge look like in the early days? Well, they had to bring in wood, okay, and the sides of it were made with wood to start with, and then in the bottom, they'd usually, if they could get it, steel, they'd put steel rims along the side. Then between the two steel beams, they would put boards. Now, agreed, that sounds like kind of a flimsy bridge, but that's all the materials they had in those days to build it, okay? That was replaced later and with steel sides on the old bridges with wooden planking, but they still made a terrible racket. When you drove over it in a car, it went blah, 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 like this, and you'd sound like you were going to fall right down through, you know, because it rattled, and it made, especially in the old-time cars that we had in those days. So they were skippy, but they got the job done, and that allowed people in Arapahoe to go to Beaver City, which was the county seat, to do business. Okay? That's where they had to go down there. All right. Granddad was, and you can read that in early Arapahoe, he was instrumental in setting up the river so that they could make power. He knew the power of water and that we could make electricity from that. Okay, and from that they were able to set up a grist mill, and I'll show you a picture of the early one. It sat down on the river, okay, and it was washed away in 1935. I mean, that all the remnants of that were left. The only thing left is at Schutz's house. You know where Cheryl and Doug live. That nice big new home they built out there. All right, this side of it, there's a little brick building. Okay, that's all that's left of the electrical plant that was all lost and washed away, and they kept that. And if you'll look at the light bricks on the side, where the bricks change color, that shows you the depth of the water in the flood in 35. The water came up to where the baseball diamond is, where the kids play baseball, right here by the railroad track. That's where the river came up to. It didn't get clear into town, okay? Because we're just that much higher than the river basin. Okay. And there was an old Indian legend that there used to be water from the top of one bluff to the other, that all of this river bottom was a huge river. Thousands of years ago, we're talking about, thousands of years ago. So we went out on the bluffs, okay, and on top of there you can find seashells, which tells you what? It used to be the bottom of a lake or a river, right? Okay, so there are lots of ways that you can prove different things like that. Min Hasty, my grandfather, as I said, was early thought about irrigating. When the town was developed and everything, he told them, he said, we can get water from Medicine Creek and build a flume and bring the water down here, and they could irrigate the park, they could do all kinds of things with the water. They could get good water. Because in the early days in Arapahoe, everybody had to have their own well. Right? We didn't have any community like we have a city. Now, there wasn't any city corporation, there wasn't any to provide electricity or water or any of the conveniences that you and I know now, right? None of that was here. So everybody had to have their own. Even when I was a child, the east side of Arapahoe still had windmills. A lot of them had their own water system, had not been hooked up to the city. So it took a lot of years for people to get on a city water system. And I lost my train of thought. He said in his work that he'd build a wooden flume for them to bring water. Well, you've all worked with wood. If you take two pieces of wood and you put them together like this and nail them together in a certain way, you're going to have a crack there, aren't you? If you were going to pour water in, where would the water go? Right on through. And people laughed at him. They said, look at that thing out there. It won't hold any water. You put water in it and the water just runs through. Well, he was a smart enough man to know what happens to wood when it gets wet, you know? It absorbs molecules of water, and what does it make the wood do? Swell, right? So it closed it, and the trough held water. Okay? And he knew that's what would happen. So as soon as the thing had enough water running through it, then it held water, and they used it to irrigate in early Arapahoe. Okay? The roads were built much later. The railroad, let's see, I think I can tell you an early story about Granddad that you'd like to hear. In the early days, there was quite a few families that first year or two that came and settled here, either out on the road or down on the river bottom. There was a family from Iowa who had a young, the father and the boy went out to hunt one day out here north of Arapahoe. And they were out there, and no one knows for sure what happened, but somehow somebody tripped, and the young boy, who was 12 or 14, I think, was killed. with the gun in a hunting accident. And so these people, being Iowans, did not have, and they didn't have a cemetery here, wanted their son's body returned to their family plot in Iowa, which is no little thing, you know, to come that far. Well, they didn't have the means to go, but they hired my grandfather to take that boy's coffin, the body, to the railroad so that they could put it on the railroad and ship it back to Iowa so the boy could be buried in their family plot. So Granddad said he'd do that. So he took it by horse and wagon, went up the Plum Creek Trail and over this way, and that Indian Trail, I'm sure that's what it is, across to Lowell, Nebraska. Now that'd be somewhere west of Hastings. Okay, you all know where Hastings is down here? About 90 miles east of here. That's as far as the railroad went. It stopped there. They hadn't built it out across this country. Okay? Can you fathom that with no railroad? Okay? That's as far as it went. So I know that that was, that Granddad took care of that. And that was no mean feat. In the early days, when a person died, they didn't know anything about embalming the body. Okay? And flesh, when a person dies, deteriorates pretty fast if it's not embalmed, if it's not treated with chemicals. The body just goes to pieces. Well, there wasn't any way to do that, but yet it was going to take Granddad 2 or 3 days to take that body to the train. Okay? Well, you can imagine that it probably had quite a bit of an odor to it. Okay? But and the only thing that Granddad had a problem with was that the wolves were aware of this. And so at night, he had to stand guard and sleep in his wagon and with his gun, because the wolves were interested in those remains that they could tell. So it was kind of a scary time to get there. Anyway, he went all the way to Lowell, put the coffin on the train, and came back again. And for payment, now this is interesting, because in the old days people didn't have a lot of money. But for payment, the people gave my grandfather 2 walnut bedsteads, which were very, very much known. I'll explain sleeping accommodations in a little bit, and my family still has them. One of them my grandfather made into a bookcase, which I have, and the other one was a walnut bedstead, in which I was born, and my brother and most of the family, and one of my nephews has that.
Start again.
We're talking about the passing of an old landmark, and we've already identified that this is a building that's situated now where the Hunt, Nebraska is, across from the Methodist Church. This building was unique in that the logs that it was built out of were not laid horizontal, they were vertical in the building. And the building had been moved several times, but it was probably the oldest building that we ever had. And these are my notes that my grandfather made about this. I noticed that the old stable east of the Methodist Church has been torn down. It brings to mind many things of long ago. It was built in 1873 by a man by the name of Gilliard Jones on his homestead north of town, up on the county line, where Mr. Thomas Thompson now lives. Now, after Mr. Jones pooped up on his homestead and he moved back to Iowa, he sold it to Mr. Lawton, and it was moved to Mr. Lawton's farm north of town, which is now owned by a man by the name of Herman Lysen. Now, from there, it was moved to his last location down where east of the Methodist Church. This was one of 2 twin houses. The other was built just across the county line from the homestead by Mr. Wright, and they were exactly alike. Both were made of native timbers hewed to a thickness of 4 to 5 inches. I forget which. The idea was to make the walls so thick that the Indians could not break through them. Okay? The Indians at that time had very few guns, and these were the old muzzle loading kind, and not very effective against 5 inches of elm or cottonwood, which is all they had to build the house out of. The writer hewed every log in these two buildings with a broad axe. This is my grandfather talking, which I have kept as a relic. As I think of these things, many incidents rush to mind, and I'll try to mention a few. Mr. Jones and his brother Edward was to marry when the house was finished, and there was old Mose, a Negro of gigantic size, and his daughter, who was 16 years of age, came to our town of Arapahoe early in the spring of 1873. Now, old Mose, which was his name, was brought along to Arapahoe to take claim for Mr. Wright and to work it for Mr. Wright and Mr. Jones, who owned the property. The girl was to do the housework. The claim was selected for Mose was the Pruden place north of town. Any of you know Connie Graining? That was her grandparents. Okay. Mose and Jones set to work as soon as they had selected their claims to build a house for a temporary shelter. They decided, as did almost settlers did, to build a dugout first. All right. So they dug this on the bank of Elk Creek, on Moses' claim near where the Pruden farm buildings now stand. It was probably 16 by 20 with a half window in the door. A roof was made of poles of hay and sod, and in the back there were two bunks made of poles, 2 tiers high, like berths in a sleeping car. You know what a sleeping car is on a train? Bunks above and below. Okay. These were divided into 2 berths each, making 4 beds, so there was room for 8 people to sleep there. During the building of the dugout, the writer was employed as a hewer of wood. My grandfather was, as a hewer of wood. And soon as the dugout was done, it was intended to start hewing the logs for the house. But a fearful accident delayed the work for some time. We needed some meat, and we concluded to go on a hunt up on Muddy Creek. So Mr. Wright, Mr. Jones, and myself started out one evening in a wagon with a yoke of steers to pull it. They weren't horses. And they got over on Muddy Creek about 3 miles above this creek west of town, and 3 miles above the county line. Well, that's a little further north. We camped and hunted deer that evening, made beds in the ground, and in the morning we were getting ready to move and had everything in the wagon except the guns. And they were lying on the ground, and Edward took a hold of the muzzle of the rifle and the shotgun that was loaded with buckshot and drew them toward him. And of course the gun went off, which I told you. Discharged, tearing an awful hole in his side. Any movement caused him great pain, so it was impossible to move him in the wagon. We cut a fork out of the tree, fastened poles across it, like a travois, Indian style, and hitched the steers to this and started our sad journey home. We had come about 2 miles when he died, and we put the body in and drove home. A rough box of lumber. Okay, so it was decided to start with him that night to Lowell. This is the story I told you about, the boy, the man who got killed. Mr. Jones was sick in bed, and the other man was in poor health, so they asked him to take the body to Lowell. And at that time, of course, there were no roads, remember, only Indian trails. There was a moon until 10, and I arrived at the fork of Turkey Creek. Now, if you know where the Dawsons live, any of you know where the Dawsons live on Turkey Creek over east?
Yeah.
Have you been over there? Okay.
Yeah, I've been there.
There's a low place there in the creek, no banks, where you can ford, where you could drive a wagon. Okay? You got to think about wagons and where our creeks are. And we have a creek every, 3¼ mile across Nebraska? So it was a difficult problem to get a wagon. How are you going to get a wagon through these kinds of things? So they had to look for places they called a ford, where the creek bed banks were low enough down to the ground so that you could get a wagon through. Okay, so this is where they were, the fork of Turkey Creek, where there was a ford. I had to camp for the night. There was not a house for 15 miles. It was a rather lonely place and cold night, but the wagon had a cover. I had some coffee, supper, debated where I'd sleep, when a pack of gray wolves showed up. Set up such a howling that decided me I did not want to sleep on the ground, so I got into the wagon and I made my bed in the box. Believe me, it was a lonesome night, but it was glad when the morning came and the wolves and the ghosts disappeared. I fed my team and was on my way at sunup, and arrived at Lowell in due season. So it probably took him a better part of a day and a half. Soon after my return, we began to hew out the logs for old Mose, scoring and beating off, it was called. That's beating off the bark so that you had a raw piece of wood. You understand what I'm saying? From the tree. I suppose this last phrase is not understood by many mere readers, so the log is rolled around on skids and a line along the place to be hewed is made with a chalk mark. And the scorer and the beater stands on the log, chops notches on the side of the log with a foot apart nearly in line. Then he splits off the part where these notches are, and the hewer follows up and him and hews right to the line. So when Mose had gone to timber, I was bent over the log, hewing away and thinking of a curly, dark-haired girl I'd left behind when I felt a smart slap on my back, and I straightened up, and here was an Indian standing there. How? Looking around, there stood as repulsive-looking Indian as I ever saw in my life, holding my rifle in his hand. He had come up and taken possession of it when it lay within 10 feet of me. He had not taken it with any evil intention, but only to keep me from shooting him in my excitement. When he saw that I was not much excited, he handed the gun to me and pointed to the large pile of chips that we had hewed out of the logs. And with the other hand patting his arm, he said to me, "Heap tired." He visited with me for a long time, was very interested with the rifle, which was a breech loader. You boys would know more about guns than I do. So he had me show me how to load it and unload it. And so he could load it and unload it himself. After a while, I commenced to hew again, and looking around, Mr. Indian had disappeared. From whence he came and whither he went, I never knew. His only arms were a bow and quiver of arrows. Hardly a day passed, but a large number of buffalo went by us. One day a herd got frightened at us and ran across the creek, and a young calf got separated from its mother. It came back to where I was working, and I wasn't paying any attention to it till it came closer and closer. It got it right up to me and stayed until almost quitting time. I intended to take it with me, but just before time to quit, a herd of its own folks, buffalo, came along, and it seemed to prefer their company to mine. And as he could run faster than I could, I concluded I didn't want to try to tame a buffalo. I will relate one more incident to close. I went to Lowell to haul a load of lumber for those houses, and as I was driving down the ridge of Elk Creek, east of Elk Creek, well along in the night, and being a lonesome, I thought I would sing a little. So I tuned up and I sang, I thought, beautifully. Now, as it happened, there was an Indian scare abroad right at that time, which was not uncommon. It happened quite often. And I was opposite the sod house of a man by the name of Foote. He and his wife were very young and were very much afraid of the Indians. I was not more than 3 miles from their house, and they heard me singing. But not being used to classical music, they mistook it for a war whoop and a whole tribe of Indians. So they crawled under the bed and hid themselves as best they could, and they lay in fear and trembling there till old Mose went over there in the morning on an errand. I have never sung since. I will now say goodbye, old little log house, and it's signed my grandfather. I thought you would be interested in that story. My grandfather taught one of the first schools here. Our first schools in Arapahoe were private. People paid to have their children get an education. We didn't before we had a public school here, and my granddad taught in that private school. And it was just over at somebody's house, and they just sat on benches. That was what they had for school. And then later they formed a public school district and everything. My granddad teach them. And this was my mother, and she ran the paper here, was a very popular person. In fact, they had, when my mother retired, they had a Jenny Cox Day here in Arapahoe, and I have all the material. I didn't bring it, but they had a special day at the park, and when she retired, she knew a lot of these things were my mother's stuff. And I told you this was her school class, and that's the old building. That's where I went to school, in the old building. This was the second building that we had. And where this building sat right here, guys, and on the back side of it, they had what they called an annex out here. And in the annex is where we had lunch. It was the lunch room and the band room. See, in the early days, we didn't have school like we have now. Everybody brought their own lunch. Okay, you had to bring your own. And so that was really something when I was a kid, to have to provide a lunch that you could buy when I was a kid, and that's where the lunchroom and the band room were all in that annex. And it was kind of a square building that sat out here east of a big tall one, two-story that's in here. And the grade school was in the bottom, and the upstairs, Abraham Lincoln, the one you have out in the hall, stood at the top of the stairs. And then the upper grades were up on top, and we didn't have any. That was before they had the high school over there. But the early days, the old building served everything until they built the high school. Okay. Because there were houses everywhere in town, but this tells you some of the things that were here. Now there's the Methodist Church, so you know what this section is here.
This is the original.
Mm-hmm. And this Episcopal church now would have been, see, this is before 1893, there wasn't any highway. All right, this Episcopal church was that spire I showed you in the picture. Remember where the K-store is?
Mm-hmm.
Sits? Okay, it sat out in the middle of the road. Well, it would be the highway now. But to build the highway, they had to move the church. So they dug a basement and they moved that church south. Now the house that sits just south of the K-store, there's a little house there on the corner, you know where it is, behind the K-store?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that was the rectory for the church. See? But the original church sat in the middle of the highway, so they had to move it south to make room for the road to go through for that big old church. And I think that's the time they took the steeple off too. Because there were houses everywhere in town, but this tells you some of the things that were here. Now there's the Methodist Church, so you know what this section is here.
This is the original.
Mm-hmm. And this Episcopal church now would have been, see, this is before 1893, there wasn't any highway. All right, this Episcopal church was that spire I showed you in the picture. Remember where the K-store is?
Mm-hmm.
Sits? Okay, it sat out in the middle of the road. Well, it would be the highway now. But to build the highway, they had to move the church. So they dug a basement and they moved that church south. Now the house that sits just south of the K-store, there's a little house there on the corner, you know where it is, behind the K-store?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that was the rectory for the church. See? But the original church sat in the middle of the highway, so they had to move it south to make room for the road to go through for that big old church. And I think that's the time they took the steeple off too. But these are all original. And then there's, let's see, what's this down here? This is the mill. Yeah, this is the mill. Now see, this is out south, isn't it? Okay. You'll find, I find a lot of interesting things on. Here's an old livery. Here, there were several of those. This was the Catholic Church. How many of you know where the Catholic Church is on the highway? Okay, well, years ago, the original, that church was moved. It used to sit down here in southwest part of town, right over here. See, here's Main Street and 10th, so it was the third lot over. And so they picked up that church and moved it up when they put the highway in.
I live like really close to it.
Okay. Well, Main, remember, is that one that runs down here south of the museum. Okay. All right, and that's the Christian church. You know where Locust is. That's still there. Okay.
It's still there.
And what does this say? Here's the schoolhouse up here showing us that. Does this say Walnut? It doesn't, does it? And this is Calvin's edition. And this was the German Lutheran Church, which is Trinity now, up there. Okay.
My library
Yeah.
used to be a church too.
Okay. All right, now here's one, 1893, and a little more at the whole thing of downtown. This was just pieces of it. Now this tells you the whole picture. Now, I thought this was kind of interesting here. See what this says right here? What does that say?
Well pump.
What's this down here? There's another one. Here's one up here. You gotta remember, everything was horse and buggy, and when people came to town, they had to have a place to water their horses. So there were horse troughs and places to water your horses and your animals. And then they had places to tie up your animals, you know, along here. Now, this tells you something. This is a millinery shop here, a ladies' hat shop. And then there's a meat market, and there's another millinery, and there's a clothing store. Okay? And hardware and harness. And, see if you can, see if you can see Klutz. Is there anything about a livery stable along there? No, that's too far south. It'd be up here.
There's a livery.
Here it is, hardware and harness. This was Klutz in here. And see, this Arapahoe house hasn't been built yet, so it should show up on the next one. It should show up. And here's a gentleman, and there's a storage. There, you learn all kinds of things by looking at maps. Here's an old livery stable. And here's the commercial hotel. Remember I showed you a picture of that and I told you it burned down? It was right off on Main Street. Okay. Here's
I'll live right now.
is this the Park Hotel?
Hello.
See? Lodging.
And hand pump.
See, there were several big houses. There's the park with the bandstand out in the middle.
I live here.
I think my granddad, being a surveyor, helped lay out the town of Arapahoe, and that's why we have such nice wide streets. He could look far enough ahead a lot of the building. People, you got to remember, wood was so expensive. People couldn't afford. That's why they built their houses out of sod, because there wasn't any wood available. There was no place to get it, and there was just no way to get that kind of stuff. So if you were lucky enough to have a couple poles to put in a sod house to frame the door, you were a pretty wealthy person. And then later they came along and they took the pieces out and they put windows and those kind of things as they could afford it. But there just wasn't, that's the difference. You look at it now, and I wish my grandfather was alive to see all the wood and the trees and everything that we have now. He would have.
Back in the mid to late 1800s, a squatter named McEachin built 2 dugouts on Elk Creek, one to house his family and one to house his animals. The family no longer lived here, where Carl Monter homesteaded this place in 1887. There was fertile land, flowing water, and abundant wildlife.
These are the original paintings from the chapel building of the Atlanta POW camp near Atlanta, Nebraska. They were painted by German POW Hans Kolliker. The building was moved south of Arapahoe. It was bought by the gun club, which became known as the Isaac Walton League. The paintings are now in the upstairs of the Furnace Gosper Museum.
There is a room with uniforms, flags, pictures, guns, and war memorabilia of all kinds. Holbrook Hornet uniform.
This is a room with dentist's equipment from long ago.
There are many examples of old barbed wire and tools. There are many household items.
There are examples of sports equipment.
There are many kitchen and bedroom items from long ago.
Women spent many hours sitting at the spinning wheel.
This cradle belonged to descendants of Daniel Boone.
This altar and pulpit came from the former Emmanuel Lutheran Church north of town.
The main room of the museum has numerous miscellaneous items. On the walls are pictures of Arapahoe's forefathers.
Captain Murphy was one of the main founders of Arapahoe.
Min Hasty did many great things for the early town of Arapahoe.
Oliver and Mercy Hasty were the parents of Min Hasty.
This display case honors Von Cross, who earned the Purple Heart.
There are many examples of antique glassware.
These are examples of baptism and confirmation gowns.
In the basement, there are fossils and Indian artifacts which were found in Furnace County.
These are show bills for the Crystal Theater, which is still in operation today.